All right, here we go. So, lecture 10.1, handling forms and user input with React. So this is a little strange, a little tricky if you don't understand what's going on. Why the the form elements are read only, why you can't actually get control of the forms. There's a reason for that, and this will hopefully explain why it's a little different than what you might expect normal behavior of DOM elements to be, right? Again, we're going through that JSX syntax and the engine that compiles down the Babel, so it's going to uh, behave a little differently than expected. So topics in this little chat here is we're going to talk about React forms. We're going to talk about the form elements, talk about user input or allowing user input, and then some form libraries we'll mention that you might want to use if you don't want to if you don't want to worry about that stuff. If you want to offload it to a third-party kind of library, yeah, you can do that too. So when we're talking about form elements, again, as we talked about JSX, there's some different syntax things that you need to worry about. Also know that form elements actually uh, behave a little differently. You have to wire them up a little bit differently. So a little bit of talk here. I mean, React has some very basic form support built in. I think it's very basic. It includes binding to the form, binding values back out of the form, assessing form elements, but there's no validation built in. So you're going to have to handcraft your own validation. That's a pain, or get some type of form library that handles your own validation. With Angular and stuff like that. Again, when we're talking about framework versus library, React is just a library that deals with rendering UI and component library. So there's not much there aside from that. You got to pull in the different pieces, right? Choose your own adventure. Whereas with Angular, all of this is baked into that huge framework. So if you remember, we had some validation already set in listening on form elements out of the box if you knew how to use it, um, and two-way binding and a lot of stuff, right? So again, the library itself that React is very small, and like I said, you need to pull in different pieces. When we're talking about routing and routers, we have to pull that in. Axios for handling data, we got to pull that in, and maybe for form validation, we might have to pull that in as well if we want to. Again, it's your choice. So React supports the standard selection of form elements, but small differences. The small differences are big differences if you're not aware of them and don't understand them, because it can be a little confusing because the HTML form elements work a little bit differently from other DOM elements in React, right? I mean, the form elements are just the markup is a little bit different. And because the form elements naturally keep some internal state themselves. So we want to kind of take control of that state. I mean, by default, the DOM elements, they have some state themselves, but with React, we want to take control of that because we need to use it for our purposes. We need to kind of override some of this stuff, so we have control of that binding and and that state. That's a lot to think about, but we'll go over that. So talking about the elements themselves, so just some small differences here. So the text input is the same as an HTML element. We need to set the but if you look at it, we have to, because in HTML you can put an input type text and then close off the bracket and put the text in between the start and end tag, but here we have to use a value prop. We have to actually use value prop equals React. We have to set the value prop. Otherwise, it's not going to work. The text element, again, is slightly different. In HTML here, we can wrap it in the opening and close tag, but we can't do that with React. We have to use that value prop to set the content. If we don't do that, we're not going to have we're not going to be able to set the value there. And that can cause a little bit of problems, especially if you want to do you want to type in a text box. By default, it's read only, and we'll get into why that is. A little difference then is also select element. If you look at that select element there, again, we're talking about value prop, but on the left side there, we have the typical HTML. You normally will have different options with values, and normally on one of those options, you're gonna put the selected. Either the DOM will update this automatically, or you will do this. And what it does, it'll select the option that is selected. But however, in the React JSX again, we need to put the value prop up to the top. Let me use my laser, my pointer, because I got it. So we're talking about this value prop up here. Now will match up with this value here. Whereas in HTML here, we have to put the selected attribute on the option itself. A little bit of a change, but again, if you don't know, it's a big change. I mean, if you don't understand why that would be, and and it's not behaving the way you would want to, I mean, it's a small detail, but again, the devil's in the detail, right? You need to know some of this stuff in order to make React work. So let me just quickly look at this in some code here. So if we were looking at app.js and we are just rendering here a functional component that returns some of those elements we talked about. So a functional component that returns JSX. Right here we have an input and we have the value prop set to React. And then we have a text area where again, we're not wrapping it. We're not doing this. We're not doing this kind of deal where we're typing and then closing off the tag. That's not going to work. That's not going to work when JSX goes in and transpiles it. So we need to set the value prop also with the text area. And then inside of the select tag here, we have two options, Saturday and Sunday. At the very top level, we have to set the value prop, the value itself. So when we actually go and render that, it'll actually look like this. And as expected, we have React. And if you notice here, I cannot type into this. I cannot type into this at all because it is read-only. So that's a problem. I cannot have user input. If I go to try to modify the state of it, I cannot. So that's a problem. We have to talk about why that is, because if you look at the code there, when it's rendering this form element, it's actually setting the value itself, and it's not changing because the component, the element has its own state, and when React is rendering it, you cannot override that. I mean, you can override it, but you have to use component state to do that. So it's a little bit of a trick, a little trickery. But again, if you're not aware of some of this stuff, then your coding is going to be very difficult. So we're going to talk about how to allow user input in just a second. All right, so user input and allowing user input. So we need to use something called control components. So it's basically we're talking about that element, but we want to take control of it in React. So in HTML we talked about those other form elements, input, texture, and select. Typically they maintain their own state and update it based on the user input. That's just part of the DOM and how the whole engine works, right? But we're overriding that in a sense because again we're running it through the JSX engine and all of that syntax, and it has its own behaviors. We need to override that or take control of it. So as you know, React has mutatable state. It's typically the state of the component, like a class component, and only there with set state can we override this and have access to mutable state. So we need to make use of that. So we can make a React. We need to make React the the source of truth, not the DOM element that by default it is. And we need to render the form and control the user input in the form. So we need to have a React component, render it. So typically a React class component. We need to have it render that form JSX, and we need to take control of the state of those elements. So how we want to do this is to recap, to allow user input. So by default, React form elements are read-only. A simple way to allow user input is to allow React's component state. So we need to allow user input, we have to do these three things. We need to add state to the component using a class component. We need to bind to the component state, and then we need to use an onChange handler to update the state. So as we're typing, the value prop could be read-only, but now we have it so that as it's typing, it's updating state, and it's calling a callback, and it's calling a callback function that is then updating the state of the class component. So we'll look at some code in a second, but I wanted to, if somebody said, why is this? And sometimes I don't, I don't really repeat a lot of baked definition, but I think in this case, in order to really understand this, I got this quote just to read it to you. It says, form elements preserve React's rendering semantics, which bind the state of the user interface to the model. So allowing users to directly input values into the form would break the model and abandon the simplicity that is React's greatest strength. So I had to give that little quote there because in a way it explained to me why would it be read only, like why that's kind of stupid, right? But that explains why we don't want to break that model, the rendering semantics. We want React to control component state and control these forms and not allow users basically to change the state on React. We want React to be the source of truth and to control the state. So that kind of makes sense to me when I heard that. So let's go back to that. Let's go back to this here. So I have another component here, which is just a text box here. And now I can actually enter text into it. But if I were to, I'm using a name form basic component that is a class component. And I have inside of the constructor, I have setup state for the value. I have a change handler, and again, I'm using this handle.bind.this. You have to do this, otherwise it won't bind correctly. And inside of this handle change event, I have set state, the value, which is the event, meaning each DOM element always has the event, right? When you're changing something, and there's a target and the value. So what that means is as I'm typing, the onChange event is going to catch my keystrokes. It's going to have that event, and the target is the value of the text box. And I'm taking the value of the text box. I'm changing the state of the component to update my new text and update the state of the component to reflect those changes. Inside of the form, I'm rendering it. I have a form that simply has a label and the input text, and it has the value. So now I'm using the state value, and on change, I'm actually handling the changes. So as I am typing, the state is being updated, and the value is then being, when it re-renders, right, the component will actually refresh and reload. It's setting it on the fly, right? It's React is using the virtual DOM, and as I'm changing it, it's setting the value, and so it keeps doing that really quickly. That's how you can actually allow user input, because by default, again, if I just set this, by default it looks like this. It's set to empty string. So if I set the empty string, and if I didn't have this on change, when I actually go back to that form, it's not going to let me type in there. Now it's read only because it's basically rendering as expected. The value is what it is. I could put React in there, but I won't be able to change React. So in order to change this, we need to add into state, and we need to add a handler that updates state. And that kind of overrides the read-only default feature in React. So that is how you have to actually make this work. And if you didn't know that, that would be unfortunate. And anyhow, I overwrote it. But that's the trick right here. That is the trick here. We need to actually understand why we can't do some things and have a little bit of a definition here. So now I can actually change the state. So that makes sense to me. All right, give me a second. I'll come back with another demo here. See, you blinked and I missed it. I loaded another example up that quick. That's how quick it was. So I have another example here. Now I'm taking all those three elements we talked about, the name, the text area, and the dropdown, and it's defaulted some things, and I've wrapped each one of those components inside of a form. And now we take it a step further. We have a handler to handle the change event. We also need a handler to handle the form event. We need to take control of the default behavior, and we need React internally to the class component to have a handler to handle the form submission, right? So when we go in here, we type the name. When I submit, React will take control of it and give an alert. Same with this. And this one says pick your favorite flavor, which is coconut, and I do not like coconut. I hate coconut. That's not my favorite flavor. So I don't know. I don't like anything in there. I'll just say lime. Anyhow, we want to look at how this works. So back in the code, I have 3 components here that I created, and there is a name component that is similar to what we just had before, but now we have this additional submission, which is handle form submit, and we have this handle change, which is updating the state of the text field, and then here we have the handle submission, the handle submit event, and we're just alerting the state value that's in the component, but then we're also doing this event.prevent default. And again, if you remember what that does, that prevents the default behavior of refreshing the page and doing a postback or page reload. We're stopping that, and we are taking control, and we're just capturing the event, and then we are stopping that postback, and then with that we are able to then do whatever we need to do. Maybe we need to call a backend API or what have you. The render stays the same. This whole part stays the same, but if you look at this, there's a handler on submit, and that is our handler. Remember, with our handlers or events, when we're handling events, we do it in this fashion. We have the expression, the mustaches, and we are passing it by reference. We are not invoking it like this. This will cause an error. We're not invoking it, and we're not wrapping this in a string. We are passing it by reference. When it evaluates, it'll know to wire it up. When the JSX translates it down, it'll know how to do the reference, right? So we have this as an input, and if you look back on the screen, we have 3 other components. We have a text area component, and we have this favorite color dropdown, and they're most likely the same. So we have, I think we had the SA form, which is, again, it's a React component. We initialize the value in the constructor, so it has that little bit of text in there, right? When it reloads, when it loads up. In the same kind of pattern, we have a handler and we have a submit. The handler catches the changes in the text area element. The submit handles the event of on click on submit of the form, and the element is the same. We have a value prop that's wrapped in state, and we have the on change event there to handle the change in the text area. So text area and text input are very similar. They allow user input to type inside. When we look at the dropdown, which is favorite flavor form. I don't know why I put coconut, because that is not my favorite flavor at all. Awful. I'm biased. Anyhow, what should I put in there? I don't know. Chocolate. I mean, really, what do you care? What chocolate? What do you care what my favorite flavor is? Really, I don't know. I'm just talking to myself here. Anyhow, beer is my favorite flavor. My favorite flavor really is beer, right? So really, that's my favorite flavor. So why not? Who cares? Anybody listening? So I'm not promoting that. I'm not promoting drinking and coding at all. LCBO is probably closed now, anyways. Anyhow, favorite flavor is beer. It makes me feel better. Feel warm and fuzzy now. So anyhow, we set it up to the default, and we have the same pattern here. State handler for changing the state. Prevent default. The only thing that's different is we have a select option, and it's not so much different, but we are setting the select value prop at the top of that, and we have the on change at the top level, which this is no different than normal HTML, but again, this is where we're targeting the selected value. A little bit different, JSX attribute, right? A little bit different and a little bit more work. And if you don't want to do this work, and if you don't like beer, then you can use a form library, and we'll just look at that in a second. We'll get set up. I'll come right back. All right, so I did have a beer. I did. But you didn't notice this because I paused it. And so now I'm back. It's seamless. Because I was talking about my favorite flavor, so why not? So we're talking about form libraries. And I got one slide. And that's it. But we're going to talk about it. So, creating forms, as we said, and making them accessible and implementing with good validation and all that stuff takes a lot of effort, takes a lot of maintenance, as we realized it. That's not very straightforward. When we get used to the pattern, it is, but libraries are good, and there's many live form libraries out there. You just got to pick one you like. It's a compromise because you're giving up control to the library, and you have to rely on the versioning and all that stuff. You offload it in case you always get in this. I don't have the latest breaking changes, all that stuff, right? Some teams like to control everything and do their own custom code. A lot more work, but at least they know where they're at. Some like to just say, you know what, let's just grab a package and run. So React JSON schema is another one that can help you with your form building. A very popular one's called Formic. So you can look at that, and basically there's a whole markup and website. Looks pretty good, looks solid to me, looks like it's been used 2.1.4. You can install it using npm, I believe. If you come down here and see installation, npm install formic --save, and it's got a lot of validation built in, some support for React Native, so there's a lot of stuff in there, and there's a big API. There's not a big API, but there seems to be pretty it seems pretty well done, to be honest, and it seems pretty good out of the box. Looks pretty good to me. Anyhow, I implemented it quickly, so right out of the box you can tell it has a lot more than just some really. So right away as I'm typing, it's actually telling me it's not too pretty right now. I'm sure you can make it look prettier. When I click submit, it'll give me a little bit of nice validation. Okay, that's nice out of the box. I don't have to worry about that. So this is checking for an email address that needs to be valid. So I can walk up to it and say admin.com, and then I can put something in there, and when I submit it, it gives me back a JSON object saying here's the values that I can work with now. So that looks pretty right out of the box. I just installed it, and then I reused it. We can quickly look at that, but if you wanted to offload some validation to a Formic form, so you include React, include Formic, you go through here, you have this Formic component, and inside of here you can do a bunch of setup in here, right? So there's some validate and initial values it has on top of it, and submit, and inside of here, again, you got to look at the markup values and whatnot. It'll tell you how to set this up very nicely, and just want to expose you to that because out of the box, you can build a nice form like that without having to do too much work. So go have a beer, or not. But if you are, think about handling forms, I guess, Anyhow, that's it for this session.